Welcome to BS session 128. Question for Mike. Why does the sun never set on the British Empire?
I don't know, Derek.
Because God doesn't trust the English in the dark.
This right here has the ability with a 30 caliber clip to disperse with 30 bullets within half a second.
Just when I think you couldn't possibly be any dumber.
You're listening to your weekly dose of BS, Ballistically Speaking. The Ballistically Speaking Podcast.
Excellent quote, Derek.
Thank you. Initially we had a different quote planned, and Mike had written it down. Mike, explain what you were going to say.
What I was going to say was we were going to take a trip down memory lane and visit some of the firearms of Kurt's youth from the late 1800s. But since Kurt's not here, it doesn't make as much sense.
Mm-hmm. And the running joke is Kurt's he's the oldest one in our group, and he's got a bit of gray hair, so we like to poke fun at him that way every once in a while. So not that there's anything wrong with gray hair. So
it's experience.
So we have Rob of the YouTube channel British Muzzleloaders here with us today. Rob, give us a quick introduction into who you are and what you do, and then we'll do our ad reads after that.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. My name's Rob, as you most eloquently pointed out. And I guess I'm somebody who's interested in shooting and interested in history. And as a result, with, I guess, some sort of creative impulse, came up with the decision to start a YouTube channel about it. And British Muzzleloaders is the result.
Awesome.
And it is quite the endeavor that you've taken on. I enjoy your content thoroughly. This is quite an experience for me right now.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Thank you very much.
But Derek, we should pay some bills before we jump into the meat and potatoes and everything.
Exactly.
Do you want to start it off?
You started off there, Mike.
I'll start it off. Folks, we are brought to you by EM Precision Rifles in Leduc, Alberta. EM Precision Rifles has the tools, and knowledge, and the support you need to achieve your goals of precision rifle mastery. A skilled craftsman and a proven solution providers, EM guarantees equipment performance second to none. Consult Shane for the build of your dreams and allow Steve to handcraft your precision tool to an experience you will not forget. Find these gentlemen on Facebook, Instagram, and on their website at emprifles.ca.
Are we on the same notes there, Mike?
I am reading what was written.
Okay. All right. I'm not. Well, anyways, call sign 66, Canada's best rifle training. Welcome to the Brotherhood. Book a course now at callsign66.ca and follow them on Instagram at callsign66 and on Facebook at C/S66. Stay tuned. They have their 4-day combined fundamentals course coming up on August 1st to 4th.
And we're also brought to you by Ripstone Gunsmithing. Craftsmanship done right. Contact Oscar at ripstonegunsmithing.ca and breathe life back into any firearm. Oscar also has a new book out titled Rust Bluing in the 21st Century. You can find that on Amazon.
We're also brought to you by March Scopes Canada. The Dion optical design line of rifle scopes has a scope for all of your hunting and shooting needs. Find Doug and Niza at marchscopes.ca.
And we're also brought to you by Apex Optics. When you buy Apex, precision comes standard. Check out all the fine competition rifle scopes, red dots, and binoculars at apexoptics.co. And just a quick note, Apex is tariff-proof. Canadian and international orders shipped direct from their Calgary warehouse, and American orders shipped from the great state of Texas. No tariffs, no hassle. And also just a quick note, July 12th and 13th, the Apex Rocky Mountain Challenge is back. Register now for this awesome 2-day PRS Pro Series qualifier match, home of the air-conditioned washroom.
Mm-hmm. Very, very nice washroom. We're also brought to you by Bolt Action Coffee. bringing specialty coffee to the precision shooting world. Order coffee and merchandise at boltactioncoffee.com.
And Odell Engineering. Pick up a Canuck shotgun, Brigade rifle, and Apex ammunition from your local distributor and tell them Phil sent you. Look them up on Instagram, Facebook, and on their website at odellengineeringlimited.com.
Sterling Arms International, home of the R18, Mark III, and the R9. Contact them at sterlingarms.com. Look out for the
Also-
R9 arriving to a store near you. They are being shipped out to dealers on a regular basis now. So now is the time to buy one for your wife and kids and a second one for yourself.
I need to admonish myself. I read the wrong notes. EM Precision is in Vegreville. I read an old ad that somehow I copied and pasted in there.
Yes, I was wondering. I'm pretty sure that was our old read.
I'm sorry. I am sorry, Shane and
So
Steve.
that's okay. Go to head on to emprifles.ca anyways.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's start it off. Rob, how did you get into historical firearms?
Okay. It's kind of it's not particularly exciting, but I would say the first sort of rifle of the genre, as it were, was a old SNLE that I got off a good friend of mine. I was quite young. And that was sort of the only one I had for quite some time, long before any aspirations of the channel were in my head. And I shot it a little bit initially, but then it soon ended up in the locker just because I was onto other things, and shooting it necessarily wasn't as fun as the initial sort of sense of pride of ownership of something, a piece of history like the SNLE. But it sat for a while, and but eventually I came back around to thinking about shooting, and it wasn't necessarily the SMLE that I was looking to shoot. And it was something that was older, but I wanted to hit what I was shooting at. And so in terms of sort of black powder stuff, and muzzleloading in particular, I was thinking more along the lines of I didn't have sort of equipment set up and purchased and acquired to reload or anything like that. So my sort of general understanding of muzzleloading was that you just sort of needed powder and a bullet. And that's like most muzzle people are into that kind of start. And my selection of what I was aiming for was something old, something military, something kind of Canadian British Empire-esque in terms of military history. And where would that now arrive me in the sort of in my search? And that put me, post smoothbore, but muzzleloading rifles. Geez, well, I knew about a Baker rifle through, sharp books and whatnot from way back when. But at the time, that was basically sort of unattainable in terms of they just weren't offered around. And that ended up with a bit of a search and arriving at a place out of Halifax called Loyalist Arms. And they were offering Euro Arms versions of P53 Enfields, which in my limited research at the time was exactly where I wanted to be. And now I had a place to find one in Canada. And that was my first sort of acquisition, as it were, that relates to what my interests sort of certainly developed into anyway. And after that, of course, the rest is history. And, it didn't end with there. And obviously that speaks to that.
It kind of snowballed a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Unavoidable and sort of, not say inexcusable, but it's irresistible. How's that?
Yeah.
That's a good way to describe it, I'd say.
So
although I must admit, at the present time, I've arrived at a bit of a plateau, major plateau, as far as I can see, is that I've sort of got a collection because I'm not a collector. I'm a shooter with a collection rather than a collector who shoots, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right.
So, but my collection of arms right now is sort of, I'm happy with it. That's not to say that if something were to come along that I would not look at, that I would deviate and maybe explore that a little bit. But I mean, we can get into that later enough, but that's where we're at right now. And that's sort of what got me into this whole thing. And then that was the shooting aspect. And at that point, it was just sort of shooting, old guns. And then it came around where I was looking for some specific information about, in particular, Enfield ammunition. And at the time, there was nothing out there. There was a couple of websites that talked about it, in very general terms. Maybe one, this was many years ago, like blogs that somebody had explored aspects of it. In particular, sort of a proper service cartridge, so a British or Empire service cartridge, as opposed to an American style, construct to the ammunition, which is admittedly much more readily available, especially then, and now it is too now. But in searching that out, I came to the conclusion that I can't find what I'm looking for. So, well, why don't I just try it myself and make some content or make a video on a subject that I'm looking for information for, and I can find it in print and in text, but certainly not in any kind of illustrative way. And that's where the channel started. It made some crappy video that's still on the channel today, and with a camera taped to a tripod overhead, and analog voiceover. I'm actually talking to the camera as I'm doing things, and I would hope that I've polished things up a bit since then, but that was the beginning of the channel, and it's just sort of in slow little incremental pieces grown from there.
So on the history side of things, were you always a history nerd, or did these interests grow together, or were they separate for a while?
I've always been a history nerd, in varying degrees and in varying genres, but invariably it's been some sort of military bent to it. I haven't been some sort of like waterworks of the Roman Empire interest or anything like that. But fighting techniques of Roman legions was kind of interesting to me, and that's kind of, especially when the black powder piece came in, is that I really started developing an interest, or developing my interest rather, in sort of British and Empire Victorian arms. It was really where, and the P-53 being in that real kind of sweet spot, and in a really important place within that historical kind of timeline. So that's sort of how my interests have collided. And as I mentioned, the SMLE a few minutes ago, was that that has come back into the fold for sure, through my learning of reloading and that kind of thing, and made it a joy to shoot again, because one, it was cheap, and two, it was just a hell of a lot of fun. And so that was what sort of brought my SMLE out of some sort of closet, as it were, and back into something that gets used fairly regularly.
So when you put your first video out, was it the feedback on it that just kind of like, I should keep doing this, or was it kind of a thing where it's like, I just need to do this as a duty to those that are looking for this information? No,
I don't think that there's never been a thing that people need to see what I'm doing. I don't hold that. I'm not saying, and it certainly isn't, especially at that time, there was no feedback. I mean, yes, there were people that commented, but this was 2012 was when I put the first, I think it was 2012 when the first video went up. So it's, I mean, in terms of YouTube lifespans, it's hung around.
Yes.
It hasn't completely died, and there's still people that are interested and very supportive, in which I'm very grateful for. But initially it was just, I'm interested in this stuff, and this is something that had I found a video like I had made somewhere else, maybe my making of a video may have not happened till a bit later with a different subject, perhaps. But at the time, those subjects were just not available, and not being able to find them, I was just like, well, I guess at some point you got to sort of make a decision. And if you don't like what you're finding, then do something about it. And that's what I did. So, I mean, the feedback is wonderful. And the audience on the channel is, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, second to none. They're very supportive. They're very excited to see, videos when they come out, and they have things to say, which are invariably either inquisitive or supportive, and or developing conversations. Oh, I have one of those. This was my experience, and so I consider myself very fortunate, especially when there's bigger channels that are out there that are sort of swamped with comments that either don't pertain at all to the video, or just people that are just being internet people.
Yes,
I find myself in the very enviable position of the channel audience is fairly focused and as you say, very supportive, and I'm grateful for that.
So when you get the idea for a video, has that kind of evolved over the years?
The process.
The
The
process.
Geez. I would say that the way my mind works and the way I approach, subjects probably hasn't
Mhm.
really changed that much, but my ability to articulate, I would hope, I'm not going to be the judge of my product. Someone else will be the judge of that. But my intent anyway is to, present subjects that in a sort of a logical and detailed way,
Mhm.
right up to, but not including the point of boredom. Now that's obviously in the eye of the beholder,
Yes.
and some people may not like and appreciate that kind of detail. For the most part, people that comment about that are positive in relation to that. But it's something that every time I do something, my thought that runs through my mind is, what would I like to see?
Mhm.
Now that speaks to this pea brain up here, but it's we talk about a given arm. If there's a specific detail of that, and there's a bit of history that I can plug in to that to help explain why it is the way it is, well, then I'm going to include that. And that goes from not only the subject of what I'm talking about in a voiceover or something, but also making graphics and pointing arrows at things and indicating various aspects of the arm or the way it's used or the way it's held, all that kind of stuff. Because that's the stuff that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the historical shooting is a genre that I guess it's kind of exists, but I have my definition of it, which I think is fairly straightforward and standard, which is there's target shooting or shooting in particular, and there's reenacting. And the two are mutually exclusive for obvious reasons, right? But I think somewhere in the middle between those two pursuits lies historical shooting. And you can lean one towards one side of it, perhaps, within the genre of historical shooting, or you can lean to the other depending on what you're doing or the subject. So, when I'm presenting something on the channel, say to do with a given battle or an action that that particular arm was involved with, then I can perhaps lean a little bit more to the window dressing presentation side with a uniform or other props or whatever. But then when we're just talking about something, I have a very simple series on the channel called, I just call it the Firepower series, and it usually compares subsequent neighboring generations as we move through time, and it's basically like a rapid shoot in a minute, and they just then compare the two, and then add a bit of history to each of them, a bit of context. Is there an anecdote or something that you can plug in at the end to sort of fill in the historical picture, and sort of tie in the experience of shooting them together against one another and tie that into some sort of history? Then that's the way that series is formulated. But then that doesn't necessarily involve any kind of the wardrobe department, as it were. So the way I define historical shooting is, one, arms that are of historical nature, ammunition that is as close to the historical as is feasible, both in construction and in performance, right? Then on top of that, so you've got arms, ammunition, and then the next thing, especially in the military context, is equipment, because equipment, and like whether it be leather or webbing or something along those lines, that really drives the way a given arm is used and the way it's reloaded. And if I'm doing anything in a presentation wise, a course of fire or something, it's going to impact how that comes about, and therefore it's something to talk about on the channel. So it kind of creates contact because of that as well. Those are the sort of key components of historical shooting, because it doesn't matter really what hat you're wearing. Well, sometimes it does when it's a big furry one, but it doesn't matter if I'm in jeans and a jacket, or I'm in some sort of purpose like design uniform costume thing. Generally speaking, a jacket isn't going to affect the shooting experience as much. So that ranks sort of last on the list of those four things: the arms, the ammunition. I'd say the fifth, because after ammunition, in the historical context, would also be the historical documentation about how it was used. So whether in a military context, it would be the drills used to teach how to handle it, how to load it, how to
Yeah,
fire it.
the manual of arms for it. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
I mean, in the terminology of the era, it was known as the platoon exercise, and that gets used and then gets turned into rifle exercises, and that's the sort of British Empire terminology for it. But yes, to by another name, manual of arms. So that's important as well. How I hold it, how
Mhm.
you load it. Do you load it with the right hand or do you load it with the left hand? Well, let's explore that and bring that to the table and present it in as close as to the historical as possible. So that's the sort of the fifth element that goes into my vision of historical shooting, and that's what drives nearly all of the content on the channel.
Yeah, I got to say you do a really good job of in like combining those things in a very smooth, and your flow, as some would say, is quite, I quite enjoy it. It's like
Uh,
it's one of those things where you just want to sit down, relax, have a cup of tea, and watch British
British
muzzleloaders.
Muzzleloaders. Well, I'm sure
So
there's time better spent elsewhere, but I'm glad that you do.
yes. So, and also
get-
like going back to the gear part and the manual of arms, I find that's also very interesting too, because um, it gives you a sense of how people would act then. Not only like firearm is a very physics based item.
Mhm.
However, if you bring the like the gear and the equipment and the manual of arms into it, it brings a more human aspect into it. In my kind of feelings about it.
Right. But it's sort of, as you say, it's one of the sort of the core foundations of what the channel's all about. Sometimes it doesn't
Mm,
really have much to play, but it will be in the background. So I know that in some of the things that I've done, like I call it the battle series, I've handled a couple of battles in, well, some might say extreme, I'd say in
mm,
reasonable detail. So those videos aren't, really shooting centric. They're shooting in them
mhm.
of varying types, but that's more along the lines of like it's almost like B-roll kind of
Yeah.
color footage to put with the explanation of that given battle and how it unfolds. And then if I can demonstrate a vignette about that action in a similar kind of way. They were shooting from behind big rocks. Well, oh, look at this. I've got some rocks I can shoot behind and
Mhm.
shoot at some targets from behind those rocks. Well, that kind of adds to the discussion of that given battle. And that's sort of the biggest deviation away from the historical shooting piece that I really deal with. And to date, I've done, well, four of those series. The first battle, the first one I did was about a battle in Egypt
Mhm.
in 1882, and that was about a 20-minute video, which I thought was okay. There was enough information there to sort of cover the battle, and I think I covered it in reasonable detail and put some shooting and targets and stuff in there. And that was a bit of an experiment. That was the first one, obviously, I'd ever done, and but then launching into all the subsequent ones, thinking. And if you actually look at my introduction to the video series of that battle, I invariably refer to in this video I'm going to talk about, and which turns into 4 videos because I go through and now we got to talk about the arms, we got to talk about the
Yep.
kit, we got to talk about the sides, the sides in the battle, we got to talk about the ground, and that's the stuff that I would like to see, and that's why these things have ballooned sometimes. I think I did a series on the Battle of Inkerman, which is a battle in the Crimean War in the 1850s. And I filmed the first footage in 2017 and the last footage in 2023.
Oh, good
And
lord.
it was five videos long, right? So
Yeah.
it just went on and on and on, but that's what it took. And by the
Mm.
time I've got all this script writing and I've explained all this parts of the battle, a video is like 90 minutes long. It's like I can't put a 90-minute video
No,
up.
no, no.
I'll
Yeah,
just
you gotta,
split that into 3
yeah,
and then
chop that up.
chop it up and make it digestible at least a bit. I find that the more things I do, the longer, like the projects just seem to get more involved as time has gone on. And most stuff nowadays is, I'm lucky to have it under half an hour.
Mhm.
There's a couple of little easy ones I do every year. There's a Cabin Fever Challenge. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, which is really simple course of fire. And it's a simple video relatively to make, and it's simple to shoot. And those videos end up being about 20 minutes or something. But
Mm.
I don't do five-minute videos.
Yeah.
Right.
From inception of the video idea to it being uploaded on YouTube, what's the average timeline you think for your videos now?
I don't know. It's something like the Cabin Fever Challenge. I can get done in like under a week. Like by the time I find the time to get out and shoot it, then get back and then edit it and put it up, it can be quick. Especially if there's a deadline like the end of March or something like that.
Yeah.
Cabin Fever Challenge, and there's been a number of years where I'm literally the last week of March, I'm out scrambling to find some place to go because my schedule didn't accommodate me earlier, and there's too much snow. I can't get into places that I need to get, and so I'm sort of constrained that way. So those ones tend to be a bit of a flash to bang very quickly. But others, like that Inkerman thing, it's the first video. It's a 6-year spread, and I just chip away at it. Typically I will never try and pump out the whole series in subsequent videos. Try and inject other subjects into the channel just so that the people watching aren't sort of bombarded by one subject for a number of months, as it were. Because I used to be able to pump out videos sort of once every 2 weeks. I would aim for, and there was a period of time where that seemed to be achievable. It's something that I've had to completely give up on. Just time wise, both two things, whether my available time to do this and also the subjects just tend to get bigger and bigger and more in depth, and there's more things I don't want to talk about and add to it. So it just seems to be going that way. So now it's down to about once a month, which I understand doesn't feed the YouTube algorithm in the way it should, but it is what it is. I'm still happily plugging along at it. It's my hobby. I really enjoy it. I enjoy all aspects of it, despite the monotony of editing. Putting together a presentation that I hope flows and is interesting to people and doesn't bore them to tears, and is interesting. It's got some action, it's got some talk, it's got some history, it's got some visual stuff to it in terms of uniforms or whatever. So anyway, that's the sort of the project and how it goes. It's a long answer which matches the timelines of video sometimes.
That's okay. Sometimes you need that. So you, obviously in a good bit of your videos, you do have full uniform, full kit. Where do you go about finding that, and what's kind of the tips for people that might be interested in finding that?
Is you'll need a diverse Rolodex, because there are very few one-stop shops for the stuff that British Victorian military kit, of which Canadian kit is the same. You're probably, when we get into the 20th century, it's a bit easier. There's places that are set up that you can sort of pick everything you need and find that in an online store somewhere, set of webbing or a hat or a jacket or something like that. But the farther back in time you go, you need to sort of start really honing in on contacts and other people and other ideas and other places. So I happen to, I have a few people that I would go to regularly for stuff like that. A pal back east, Graham, the leather guy back east in Ontario. He does not bespoke, but he certainly does Victorian leather equipment and does very good work. I've got a couple of pieces from him, and I've made some of the stuff myself. All the simple things. I can sew. I can make kit like fabric. I'm very comfortable doing that. Like all the valises and knapsacks on the channel, I've made myself. The haversacks and bags and things like that, I've made myself. But when it comes time to one, clothing, and two, leather work, like a cartridge, ammunition pouch from the Victorian area, like I've dabbled a little bit. A lot of it's time. The time it would take me to learn and to perfect it to my standard, to what I would like to see, it would be a hobby unto itself. But if I can help out another small business, like Graham, for instance, or Lawrence from Shed Time Leather in the UK, I've got a couple of slings from him. If that's an easy yes for me,
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
The funds that come in through the gracious donations through Patreon from the patrons of the channel, that money gets put towards things like that. And if I can pass that along to other small businesses, then I'm happy to do that, especially as those ones I've listed, deal in like good handmade, good quality stuff.
Yeah.
Then there's other things. A few sets of my equipment have been bought. My 71 Valise equipment was bought online. Pretty standard, kind of crap quality, like low end reenactor kind of stuff that I bought and basically rebuilt the whole thing using all the brass work that came with it, which was fine quality, except for the belt buckle. But rebuilt the belt. But then I had to use the little brass rings that come with the braces over the shoulders and the buckles and all that kind of stuff, but then rebuilt it all so that it's proper and of the proper dimension and whatnot. So, there's things like that I'm capable of doing. And as I said, clothing is like a black art to me. So I can make a dart, or I can, hem a pair of pants, but I can't make a pair of pants. At least I have no experience of doing that.
Yes.
And those that can, my hat is tipped to you, because how you turn a straight line or a measurement around your arm into some curved piece of material that's going to fit and then fit into the jacket, like I just no. So there's a few places for clothing that I've gone to, some of which have been more successful than others, some of which have been less successful. But in that genre, especially, you get what you pay for. And so when you don't pay money for stuff, or a lot of it, then chances are you're going to end up with something that you're going to either not be happy with, or are going to have to put some time and effort into fixing. And for the most part, when I have gone down that road in some places in Pakistan and whatnot, the thing arrives and it might fit across the shoulders, but it's for something you can fit 3 people around the waist. So that means, a bit of taking in, or a lot of taking in, and then cutting, tunic skirts down and rearranging the angle of certain pieces and repositioning cuffs. I can manage that because it's kind of blocky and chunky. I can take the cuff off and resew it somewhere else, but making it all together is something that I'm just not familiar with. So that's I can't say Cole's Notes explanation, but that's where that whole thing kind of lies. So there's a whole bunch of different places to go. I've dealt with some tailors local to where I live, and the product they've put out has been fantastic. There's a couple of places in Canada, back east in Ontario, Historical Twist is one that makes very, very high quality clothing and of historical nature. So some of my Napoleonic jacket comes from there, and I've just recently taken delivery of another uniform from the 1850s. So I haven't put that to work yet, but I will. Yeah, it's as they say, it's unfortunately there's no place you can point someone to. I've listed a couple of businesses, and I do so because I've purchased stuff from them and I've been happy.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's one of those things. Stuff from the 1800s, they just don't quite make it anymore. So it's very understandable, that answer.
Sure,
Now,
and invariably that stuff gets made by people with not if the interest isn't the same as mine, but they're on the same level. They're interested in that era of history, and they've learned how to put it together, and they can make it to a good high standard. So as I said, I'm happy to patronize those businesses for sure.
Now I must I gotta say, obviously right behind you, for those that are just listening to this podcast, right behind Rob is a rather full bookshelf. So let's go into that, the documents and research for these videos.
Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of books. I guess you could probably group them into 2 or 3 groups. The first, which you can't see here, it's in another bookshelf, is and that collection of books is augmented by what I have sort of digitally, which are all the manuals. So you can find, I think the oldest manual I have printed is 1854. I'm just trying to think. That's the oldest printed manual I have, which is an original document from 1854. And it's a musketry PAM, or a musketry book. And it in that goes through all the drills and the courses of fire that they used at the time. Once you get to about 1870, things stop being available online. Maybe into the early 1880s, you can find some manuals online, like through Google Books or things like that. Things that have been public domain that have been scanned and they're on the web somewhere. But after that, it's pretty much printed only. So I've been able to sort of, there's two kinds of books. Is one like the infantry manual, which will often have, and the terminology and the subjects of those books changes over time. But especially early on, there's like it's called the Field Exercise and Evolutions of Infantry, which is all your drill and how to hold it and how to shoot it and like the movements. And then you've got the musketry book, which then talks about the courses of fire and the program of shooting in that time frame. And so matching those two together, and they don't always come together in the same year. Sometimes they overlap, but those are really my go-to sources of information when it comes to doing anything like hardcore historical. When it's a specific arm, like say the Lee Metford or something like that in the 1890s, you can go to a couple of different versions of infantry drill, which is like 1896, 1898, and also the rifle exercises book, and then the musketry manual. And so with the combination of those, you can paint a picture in your research and come up with a product. And that's a subject I dealt with. I haven't shot yet. It's one of those on the shelf projects to do the course of fire from the late 1890s, sort of on the cusp of the Boer War. Right? And to see what sort of a British or Empire soldier trained up to the Empire standard, or the British Army standard rather, were what they would have anticipated shooting during the year. So I've done a few videos similar to that. I did one about with the Martini. I did a version, a scaled down version for the Enfield many years ago. So that, and unfortunately, for those projects in particular, range is a problem because up until just before the Great War, so we're talking about 1914, 1909 is when that musketry book comes in. Up until that, you shot at 800 yards, everybody.
Wow.
And so finding a place to shoot 800 yards is problematic, especially where I live and being sort of invariably surrounded or in mountainous terrain. It becomes very difficult. Mountainous and forested, by the way.
Yes, yeah.
So,
these mountainous and clear in areas is very beneficial to long range shooting.
100%.
Over mountainous and fully forested, very difficult.
Not so much.
Yeah.
So those projects, as much as I just love to get out and do them, is driven by that. And I was able to eke out 700. And I actually used a claw when I shot the Martini musketry course. I eked out in the book. It says actually, if you don't have access to 800 yards, you shoot the 800 yard practice at 700. So you basically double up at 700, which is actually a provision in the book. So I was like, okay, check.
Yeah.
Good to go. I'll go with that one, and I'll just shoot at 700.
It's written down, so it's good to go.
You have to, and the corner actually was sanctioned. The cutting that corner is in the book, so I didn't feel there was a problem with that. When it came time to say do some of the shooting that I did with Sea and Arsenal a number of years ago, that was on a proper range, and it was out to total of 700, I think. But the Bren shooting and Lewis shooting was at 500. So it was within the confine, within the capabilities of that range. But even 500 is stretching it out in terms of being in the mountains. If I had nice wide open spaces, especially something that was dedicated, I could be knocking these projects out like left, right, and center. But having to find them first, and then invariably they're long ways away. So that requires a bit of an expedition to get there and then hang out there and do what I do. So
we got a question in the chat from, hold on, where's the mouse? From Mike, our friend Mike in Sterling Arms.
Yes, I think that sounds almost like a baited question. Do I happen to have a Bren gun, Pam? Yes, I have a Bren gun, Pam. Yes, I have them. I have them digitally, and I have one hard copy.
Okay, because I know that Mike has a a Bren in proximity to him. Let's just put it that way. So,
Well, if
Well, yes, it's right here.
yeah,
not that one. That's the mini Bren that Mike 3D printed.
the most of the manuals that I have from the World War II era are found, they're digital, and I've downloaded them from the Vickers Machine Gun and Collection and Research Association website, which was perhaps the one key that I found. And Richard started his sort of website. I can't remember the exact date, but it seemed to sort of coalesce with my discovery of it. And then he had manuals online that he had scanned and put there, and they were available for download. So his efforts in producing, and which he still does regularly in scanning and publishing these old manuals of a number of subjects, not just Bren guns, for instance. But his collection online is growing, almost weekly, and just an incredible resource for somebody like me who's looking how, in the case of the Bren, then like, what are the exact drills for it? How do you lie behind it? How do you fire it? And then what do you fire when it comes to actually the range course and whatnot? And all that was found at Rich's website. So again, an incredible resource, and, a lot of things on the channel would not have happened had it not been for, places like the Vickers Machine Gun site. So
yeah, I think it's also very, very important to the digitization of that resource, because unfortunately, as these books have been out of print, these manuals have been out of print for well over a century now, and unfortunately, the old box in the corner that unfortunately every once in a while one gets tossed away, and there's fewer and fewer, and yeah, it's definitely very important that that stuff gets uploaded online. So,
well, as they say, he's doing, yeoman's work, making sure that happens. And it's just there. I find them just really interesting as a window into history. Like take the number, the rifle the pamphlet for the rifle, which is, starts at beginning World War II with the SMLE, and then halfway through it transitions to the number 4. And the drills they were taught, and the way they were taught to do things, because that's, you mentioned those, thousands, millions, in fact, of individuals who had been brought into the army one way or the other and sat in little huts or in the middle of fields getting trained by a corporal or a sergeant. Like, this is exactly what they were trained to do and how they were trained to do it. And then when it came time that they had all this dry training done in terms of how to load it with dummy rounds, how to fire it with dummy rounds, how to hold it properly in all these different positions, then they graduated to the range, and then they had a prescribed course of fire that they shot. And due to Rich's efforts in publishing all this stuff, you have access to this now, and you can actually go through and put yourself back in 1943 as an infantry private, qualifying his yearly shoot on his rifle. And that's exactly what he did. And there it is, laid out for you, exactly how to do it, the number of rounds, the ranges, the targets, all that kind of stuff. And that, for me, that's interesting.
For sure.
And that's what, again, I do stuff that I always check myself. Is this something that I would like to see? And if it isn't, then I either don't do it or I modify it so that it is interesting to me. So if it's not detailed enough, as you might have guessed already, I'm kind of bent that way.
And also you can kind of see the progression of history and like tactics and understanding in the warfare context of how it has evolved in that regard into, how is it operated? What is the course of fire? That kind of alludes to the understanding of the day. So
I completely agree with you. Yeah, it's always though it's for interesting for me anyway to you go down the rabbit hole with the manuals and the drills and the all that kind of stuff, and then you able to and also on the tactic side, like you mentioned, when you talk about not just the musketry book, but like the infantry book, for instance, which has the formations and all the way they were taught to, like, how they were taught to march together and the way they would form up together and all that kind of stuff. And then you can see that, as you mentioned, that how the tactics will change over, from era to era. And then you apply the relationship between the arm of that era, and you see the tactics change, and eventually progressing through. It's fascinating to me, is tracing that lineage of battlefield sort of, tactics, I guess,
Yeah.
which is sometimes it's changed by a new arm, and sometimes it's changed later, like later than you'd expect, by a new arm, and then other times it's something that's gone the other way. And then on top of that whole construct, you can layer in the anecdotal and the historical side, so the performance or the result of given battles. But when you talk about, say, like Islandwana during the Zulu War in 1879, a famous decisive defeat of the British in Zululand, to be able to understand how the men were trained and how they would have reacted and how they would have fought and deployed in the field and then fired at their enemy, in terms of, it wasn't just blazing away at them. Were they controlled in firing volleys? At what point would they have devolved into independent firing? Because you've got that whole knowledge kind of foundation from the manual, and say, oh, okay, well, this would apply directly to this position during that battle. And then you read an account and they talk about volleys being fired. All right, I know exactly how that happened. I know the words of command they used. I can picture it. And when I, especially building a project for the channel, you can sort of put yourself in that position, both physically by a video clip, shooting that very rifle in exactly that way. And so for me, anyway, that's what I'm interested in. So I hope that comes across in the products that I produce.
Oh no, definitely it does. Let's get into arms. Let's get into reproductions versus original pieces.
You mean how they're handled in Canada?
Yes, yeah, we can go into that as well too. So,
if I was going to try and find one, where would I look?
Right. Well, it depends on what you're looking for.
Something rifle, percussion cap, late 1800s.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of British arms that are rifled and percussion cap, we're talking about one family and one other rifle, right? So the Enfield family of muzzleloading rifles. So when I started the channel, there was basically the Italians that were making them. And when I say Italians, I mean Euroarms. I think there's a Army Sport, and maybe there was one other. And they were sort of almost cornered the market, maybe in the general sense anyway. Sort of hanging out in the background and no longer produced were a series of Enfields that were produced by Parker Hale in Britain. And they were, I guess, famously made to the same standard as the originals as far as the parts, the dimensions of everything, made with and gauged with the original gauges.
Oh, interesting.
That would have been used to check the manufactured part to make sure that it's the right width and the right thickness and whatever. And on the Enfield side, importantly, Parker Hale Coldhammer forged their barrels, which obviously wasn't a technique used in Victorian times, but
definitely didn't do that.
In being able to use that technique, they reproduced the type of rifling that was found, which is called progressive depth rifling, in that the grooves are deeper at the breech than they are at the muzzle. For instance, in a P53, it goes from 15 thousandths deep, and there's 3 grooves in a P53, so each one of those 15 thousandths, and it's 5 or 3 at the muzzle. 5, I think it is. So it diminishes, and then they found it was done for, I think it was discovered by the French. My pea brain's not functioning right now, but it was discovered, and it was thought about for other reasons, but they found that it was very effective in dealing with the ammunition that they were constructing for it. And so it became something that, though not initially rifled that way, like the first models of the P53 were just like straight rifled, but consistent depth rifling. And then very soon on into production, they adopted this method, and Parker Hale reproduced that. And to date, they're the only company that it has. currently, the Euroarms thing, Armor Sport, there's still lots out there, especially in the US reenactor world, in varying states of sort of authenticity, if you will. But Pedersoli, which is obviously a very well-known and generally reputable company out of Italy as well, they have taken on the mantle of sort of holding the torch for the P53 and Enfield family, and they have basically reproduced in their own way the whole family as Parker Hale did. So that means the P53 Enfield, the P58 naval rifle, the P61 artillery carbine, and the Whitworth, and what Parker Hale called the Volunteer. And I think Pedersoli's got a Volunteer, which has got a different rifling. It's a small bore 45 caliber, much like the Whitworth. And that's what I own. I don't own a Whitworth, but I own the Volunteer. So I think Pedersoli's generally reproduced almost all of those as well.
Yeah, and a number more too. I would say they're probably the most recognized for the person that's. I know me personally, I'm not big into that era, but I will come across the stores online and see sharps or etc.
Right. Yeah, they have a huge collection for them, a huge production, a line of, like you say, sharps or Remingtons or all that kind of, generally Victorian or era, 19th century anyway, and a lot of black powder and whatnot. But I think they reproduce, Marlins and Winchesters as well. I might be wrong on that, but there's certainly the sharps and the rolling blocks. I think they all do make reproductions of them for sure.
I almost feel like there's a point that once you get into firearms, you want everything that's new for a lot of people. And then once you're in it for a while, you're like, where did we come from? I want to go back to the start a little bit and kind of see how we got to this point. I think that's really how, in my opinion, that's how people get into the older arms.
Right.
Your experience might be different, but
yeah, well, I mean, never having owned anything new, it is something, I guess it's the history interest in me was what drew me to that. And as I mentioned earlier with that P53, and then it branched out from there. I ended up almost immediately tracking down a Brown Bess, an India pattern Brown Bess. And that was following shortly after. And then from there, I think I went to a copy of a Baker rifle that was made in India and smoothbore that I had rebarreled. And so that was my third that I ever acquired. And this was many, many, many years pre-channel, mind you. But nonetheless, it was sort of when it came time that I wanted to explore things on the channel, I had a certain degree of collection sort of built at that point. So
when you mentioned Whitworth, are we talking the infamous Whitworth rifle that was
it depends. It's infamous depending on who you talk to. Are you talking about the U.S. general that got shot with one? Then it would be infamous. If you're talking about someone who won a shooting competition in 1864 with one, then he would probably be famous and most appreciative. But yes, it's that Whitworth. So at the time it was small bore 45 caliber nominally, and rifled with in the case of the Whitworth with Whitworth rifling, which is hexagonal, so it's polygonal rifling. It's as opposed to a cut groove, and fired interestingly. It's a kind of a really detailed and interesting story, and it's fraught with a lot of sort of imperfect information. So Whitworths generally in the military context, which they actually were a thing, generally fired round bullets, like cylindrical bullets, and but there were hexagonal bullets made for the Whitworth. And what that did, though, was enable I don't know, do we have to go down this route? You would let me, I'm rambling. I'm thinking.
No, that's okay. I like the technical details.
We're all in on long range shooting. This is perfect for us.
Yes.
So the thing about the Whitworth, it was sort of the first stab, and it was Whitworth's personal, development. And he made some series of experiments and came up with basically he took parameters of the service round and the service paradigm, which was about a 530 grain bullet and about a 70 grain powder charge, right? And with those constraints, it's like, how do we make that piece of lead and that powder charge perform better than the Enfield, which is the service rifle of the era? So we're talking the 1850s here, late 1850s. And he, through his experiments and his genius, came up with, well, if we reduce the caliber but keep the weight, obviously the bullet has to be elongated. And today we would know that as a much increased ballistic coefficient, right? You've got the same weight behind a smaller cross section with a better nose. You're going to have better performance in terms of the way it carries. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he found that out, and then he figured out what was the best way to stabilize such a large, long bullet. And he came up with about 1 in 20.
Yeah.
Right? How to spin it at the right rate. So a 1 in 20 inch was about where he ended up. Target rifles of the era, sometimes they go like 1 in 18, but the Martini Henry, which is a product in a roundabout way of ultimately what started generally with Whitworth in terms of bringing a rifle to market. The Martini Henry is a 45 caliber, small bore rifle. It's a breech loader, but it fires, a bullet of 45 caliber, and it's a bit lighter. It's about 460 grains. But those concepts were there. Slightly smaller bullet. A Martini Henry is 1 in 22 inches. So it's around 1 in 20 inch twist. Whereas the Enfield was 1 in 78 twist.
Right? 78.
Yeah. The Baker rifle, which is the famous rifle that Sharp, in the Sharp series of books and subsequent television programs with Sean Bean, the only series where he doesn't die. And, the Baker rifle had 1 in 120 inches. So
I think that's just invertly threaded at that point.
Yeah.
It's almost straight. I mean, it is obviously twisted.
Yeah.
It's almost straight.
It's a lazy lean.
Yeah. So the barrel's 30
is.
inches, and that was a quarter turn in the barrel, right? So, which is a lot of the period terminology speaks that way rather than a twist per inch. But anyway, I digress. What Whitworth found was that with the bullet made out of lead would upset because the hexagonal bore was, the grooves, the corners of that hexagon are, when you put a circle inside it, they're quite deep. And so when the bullet fires, and I actually recently just did a video on this, is the principle by which a small bore muzzleloading rifle operates is because the bullet's so long, is when you fire it, the back of the bullet starts moving before the front. And in doing so, it basically squishes. And just using the inertia of all that lead, the front wants to stay put, as things typically want to. But when you push at the back against the front, it turns that bullet and it pushes it, it squishes it, and there's only one place for the lead to go, and that's out. And so it fills the rifling.
Yeah.
And for a soft lead bullet with that degree of powder charge, it worked, and he got it to work. But what he found is that, especially for longer ranges, and especially in a non-military context, was that can we make it better? And especially in relation to the penetrative abilities of that bullet, which means faster and make the bullet harder, because lead is only so hard that it's going to penetrate without massive deformation through a certain amount of. They used to use elm planks. That was what their standard was. But he found that if we want to make it more penetrative, then you harden the lead. But when you harden the lead, it doesn't upset as much, and it's harder to upset. You need a harder power charge. But if you made the bullet hexagonal, then it fits very closely. And if you can imagine, concentric hexagons versus a circle inside of a hexagon, all those corners are filled up almost all already. And so there's very little expansion that has to happen, which is afforded by the harder bullet. It can't expand to the same degree, but it doesn't need to. And now you've got a faster, harder bullet that flies flatter, and it can go through more things.
And you use your powder more effectively.
Right. And so that that drives the hexagonal piece to the Whitworth. And there's so much, especially in the American context and the American Civil War context, is sort of this is what they were, this is how they were used, and this is, it's a Whitworth, it shoots a hexagonal bullet. Well, to be honest with you, when it leaves the muzzle, they're all hexagonal, right? Because the round one bumped up and it became hexagonal on the way down the barrel.
Yeah.
But I digress. It's a very interesting sort of almost a subgenre, because of they're experimenting with this stuff in the 50s and into the 60s. But by the mid 60s, they're like, well, wait a minute. These things are proving themselves to be much more effective in terms of the ballistics. They can shoot faster, therefore flatter and out to farther range. And they're physically more, like, what's the word you want to use? Precise. Like a given grouping with a Whitworth is much smaller than a given grouping.
Precision.
So the technology is way superior, but what's on the horizon in the mid 1860s is breech loading. And so, boy, we need to, first of all, we need to get, and this is the British context, mind you,
Yeah.
we need to like jump on this. And so by the late 60s, the Snyder comes into service, and it's using the same barrel as the Enfield with a different breech mechanism screwed on the back. So ballistically, the Snyder is very similar in terms of the weight of the bullet and the powder charge to what the Enfield would fire. But that's old technology. That's a 5.77 caliber rifle with 70 grains of powder. Doesn't fly as fast, and it's just a big chunk of lead that's really fat. So it slows down really quick. But
It's like shooting a potato.
Yeah, exactly. But shooting the small bore stuff. It's as they say, the small bore, which is funny today. You'd think a 45 caliber rifle is a small bore, but that's the way it was back then.
Yeah.
This is the way to go. But then we want breech loaders. So there's this kind of parallel lines of development. They get the breech loading aspect into service right away with the Snyder. But in the meantime, they're buying time so they can. Yes, we can get the guys a breech loading rifle in their hands. But while we're doing that, and we can bring the rate of fire capabilities with breech loaders into the Army, what we can do is buy time to develop a proper breech loading and small bore rifle, and that ends up being the Martini Henry. So that's sort of the Snyder. Yes, generally, especially the British regular Army, it does go from the Enfield to the Snyder to the Martini. Obviously, it's a big army spread all over the world. It just doesn't happen overnight. So, the first Martinis are issued in 1874 about that, but then you still got units with Snyders in 1876, even 77, I think is the latest date I've found. So they're hanging on to these things a bit longer, and if we put that as a timestamp, the Zulu War, famous for the movies they made it with Michael Caine and all that, that's 1879. So the Martini by that point is still basically brand new. Yeah. So again, the history, the lineage of these arms in the British and Empire, and when I say Empire, I mean the Canadian context, because up until 1980s, our arms are the same generally, right?
Yeah.
Until we go to the 5.56, and then the Brits go their way. But before that, we're both using FN rifles with 7.62 NATO, kind of essentially the same rifle.
Yeah.
So when I say that, and that's sort of why the channel is called British Muzzleloaders, because to say Canadian muzzleloaders doesn't really mean anything, but to say British muzzleloaders, that's what they are, because they were what we used in Canada. And the history of Canada is not something I shy away from. But when you talk about, say, the Martini, well, Canada didn't really use the Martini. It used it in very select circumstances and very small sort of areas of the service paradigm. But generally speaking, we use the Enfield rifle musket. We use the Snyder for way longer than we should have. We use the magazine Lee Enfield coming into the Boer War, and then of course the SMLE and the number 4 and all that. So they're very similar, and that's sort of why I picked the name, because I couldn't call it Canadian muzzleloaders. Well, I could have, but it wouldn't have made sense to me.
I just want to go backwards for a second, because we talked about these kind of intersections of history, and Joseph Whitworth was the creator of also what we now know as British Standard Whitworth thread. Now, that's interesting is technologically, because that was the first standardized thread, way before, SAE, metric, etc. And I find that really a pivotal part in the Industrial Revolution, because prior to that, essentially, a blacksmith or a machine shop, they would kind of just make their own thread, hokey pokey, whatever. And, if you needed a nut or bolt, you had to go back to them. But the standardization of thread as well, too. Obviously, for me, I'm a mechanic in the mechanical world, is also a pivotal part. And also, unfortunately, I had the pleasure to work on a Merle's Blackstone engine, which was built with British Standard Whitworth thread. And let's just say it is quite confusing, as for most of us mechanics now, we know that a wrench size is the size across the flats of the hexagon. That is the bolt head. But with British Standard Whitworth, the wrench size is actually the bolt diameter. So it gets very confusing. It's like, oh yeah, pass me a 9/16 wrench. And all of a sudden you get a much larger wrench than anticipated. So,
It's fine if that's the only system you use, right?
yes.
Which at the time it would have been. And if you know the system, right? When
Yes.
you're in the system, it's very easy. You know exactly what you want. But having to dabble in it is like what you're saying, right? If you were, I don't know if our Land Rovers were threaded.
I'm not sure about the
know.
continuation, but I know
Yeah.
I know
That's-
it's
when you
pretty
said
much
that's-
it's pretty much gone metric across the world now. Even
Right.
American made cars are designed and produced in metric. It's only really there's some holdouts in the heavy equipment side where like say the bolts in the frame will be standard, but pretty much I think it's across the board metric. So
Interesting. I didn't know that.
mhm.
That also speaks to where sort of Whitworth was all about, and that is not being a gun designer.
Mhm.
He was an engineer,
Yeah.
right? And a brilliant one at that. But just not. He wasn't the John Moses Browning of his era.
Mhm.
He was just a really smart cookie who took the challenge up and came up with a solution for it. And that's an interesting part of and he's been obviously pivotal in terms of history. But the firearm piece is just sort of a small little piece of what he brought to the world.
Yes, and also sorry, I got to nerd out on this as well too.
Nerd away.
So he, since we're talking about nerding history, so he popularized the 3 plates method for producing accurate flat surfaces. In terms of like the kind of origins of precision in the Industrial Revolution, which obviously does pertain to firearms, having a perfectly flat surface is important if you want to place tooling on it, say if you're making a lathe, say if you're making a mill. So essentially the theory behind it is that he took 3 plates, let's say cast iron, and essentially in order to flatten them, obviously you can flatten something close enough by eyeball. Obviously, if it's got a big dip in the middle, it's pretty easy to see. But to get it within, a thousandth, a 10,000ths of an inch, you have to figure out how to measure that flatness. But if you don't have something already flat, so you know to be perfectly flat, it's kind of an interesting geometry problem. So essentially what he would do is he'd lap 2 plates, and in theory, you lap them down, you match them to each other. However, there can still be inconsistencies. You could still have a cup and a bowl situation. So you introduce a 3rd plate and you lap them in unison to the point where all 3 essentially perfectly match each other. And it's just kind of a mathematical geometry thing. And then at that point, you've achieved a perfectly flat surface plate. From there, you can build precision tooling on, and you can increase the overall precision of the Industrial Revolution. And that's also, I got to give credit to him because that is a genius thing. He made essentially something out of nothing. He made a plate precise to within 10,000ths of an inch.
Yeah, that's crazy.
With just his brain, essentially, and a little bit of lapping compound and some time. So
That's it makes me in awe of some of these guys who just were able to sit down and just figure stuff like that out. Something that you take completely for granted today, but just didn't exist. And they had to invent something like what you're talking about in order to achieve what they quickly learned was needed, but couldn't be produced. Right. Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
Well, then everyone around the day would be going, "Hey, did you hear Whitworth? He invented flat. We need to all go over to his shop and see it." Like they would share their information with everybody. Now everything's so proprietary that you wouldn't share anything with anybody.
Right. Yeah, things were a little bit different, although capitalism was well in hand in the sort of Victorian and Britain. That a lot of people making a lot of money, a lot of businessmen, running companies and things like that, and vying for favors in industry and this kind of thing. One of the sets of equipment actually to take that aspect and turn it into something pertaining to the channel was the Slade Wallace equipment, which is the British infantry equipment from the 1890s. and on through the Boer War was basically a imperfect designed set that was lobbied for by Slade and Wallace, who are the designers of it, or nominally the designers of it, and basically got it adopted by the Army because of their patronage and calling in favors and a bit of bluster, a little bit of bullying, a little bit of marketing, and throw that all together, and all of a sudden, these two fellas able to put their name and make all the royalties off this set of equipment that then gets equipping the entire British Army. So.
Wasn't that kind of how the Ross got weaseled into the Canadian Army? It was one of the generals who was a good friend of Ross.
I'm sure there was all kinds of patronage going on like that. The exact story, I'd have to get into the books again and come up with that. But I think that there's always going to be, especially at that time, there's always going to be some degree of, like, I'd say nepotism, but
Yes.
I know somebody and they can put a good word in for me, and constantly mention it in the meeting, and eventually someone's going to say, well, what is that all about? And then there's my in. I can come and make a presentation, or sometimes it's even simpler than that. It's like, I know a guy and let's go with him. Okay. But the story of the Ross in particular, being Canadian, is something that is it's actually surprisingly brief. It doesn't last very long, and as infamous as the rifle is, or shall I say, there's actually almost two rifles, right?
Yeah, let's
later.
Let's go into it, because
let's jump into the Ross.
Yeah, let's jump in, because we do have a number of American listeners that may not be as well versed in the Ross as us Canadians. So dig into the Ross for us, please.
Well, in terms of how it comes about, is in the aftermath of the Boer War, and in Britain in particular, they're looking to change their rifle as a result of some of their experiences in South Africa, and adopt a universal, at the time, short rifle. And they take the general design of their current service rifle, which was the magazine Lee Enfield, and they shorten it, thus becoming the short magazine Lee Enfield. But at the time, there was no industrial capacity to start making rifles for other people, other countries, even though they're part of the empire. And so there were inquiries made coming out of the Boer War. Canada, going into the Boer War, had just purchased, I say just, Boer War started in 1899, and Lee Enfields were purchased in 1895. So they were hot off the press. The British Army didn't even use the Lee Enfield at that time, which is a little
interesting,
little understood fact in terms of the way arms were produced and then issued. Is the date that's typically associated is the date of adoption, i.e., like, this is the pattern we're going forward with. But then from that point on, arms are made to that pattern. But you've already got thousands and thousands of rifles actually in the hands of troops of an earlier pattern. Yeah. And you've also got thousands of rifles in store, just waiting on racks for replacement of ones that ultimately might get damaged in battle, waiting for expansion of the army in time of war, any number of reasons. So you've got rifles in service, rifles in store, and then you start making new ones. So in the British way of doing things is that you don't get rid of something if it works. And so Lee Enfields get produced from sort of 1895. I'm not sure. You have to look into Skennerton in terms of when the first order gets produced, but it's close to it anyway. And the difference between an Enfield and a Metford is just the rifling, but it's the same rifle. They put all their Lee Enfields in store and don't really come into play until the army expands and is suffering, battlefield attrition in South Africa. And now we need new rifles to replace those ones that are lost in battle. The wastage on the battlefield, but also the army expands. The imperial troops come in, as well as volunteers. The volunteer, which is like their part-time sort of reserve army at the time. They have a huge role to play in going to South Africa. They all need to be armed with the sort of up-to-date weaponry. So all the Lee Enfields come out of store, and arm these. And so that's when the Lee Enfield proper gets sort of its debut. So Canada buys those right in 1895 to finally replace the Snyder, which has been going since 1867-ish. Yeah.
It's a good run.
And they're just worn out. They're ancient rifles. They're 2 generations behind where we should be.
Mhm.
2 in terms of the generation of arms. So they're ballistically just hideous things. When you compare it to a 303, which is where we should be at that moment, so we get to that in 1895 and we enter the Boer War. Our contingents that go there are armed with the most up-to-date service rifle the Empire has. Yeah. Coming out of that, there are a lot that are wasted. So there's ones that are lost in action. The army has grown in terms of its contingents going to South Africa. So we need new rifles. And now the new way forward is this sort of SMLE concept, but there's no capacity to produce them. So Canada basically pivots. And through probably a convenient word in Parliament, ends up looking towards this, some might say crackpot, some may say, fellow that could just shrewd businessman, some may call him, right? But he has been
dubious.
working at designs of rifles himself, mostly regarding one parallel development is in terms of the 280 cartridge, which is essentially a Magnum cartridge, which is particularly important in the post-Boer War era, because much like the Americans, as I've read, are going through this paradigm of trying to think about how they can shoot farther and flatter and heavier hitting. Well, the British and the Empire are thinking along the same lines, and the Ross is one of the parallel development avenues that the Ross goes through. Is to the Ross rifle with a very strong action is chambered in 280, which is like a laser beam.
Oh yeah, we actually a couple episodes back we briefly we were doing some old cartridge talks, and we talked briefly about the numbers on the 280 Ross, and at the time, very impressive cartridge.
Sure.
Very impressive. You're nearing it with the right loading. You're nearing 3,000 feet per second.
It's just cooking.
Yes.
And so the Boer experience coming out of that, out of the war rather, is like long range, open terrain. The veldt and the sort of the geography of South Africa, and it's this obsession. In the artillery they have it, in the infantry they have it, the cavalry are along for the ride. But pardon the pun. But in Canada, the parallel development in the Ross is the 280 piece, but it's never adopted as a service cartridge, and we need to maintain some sort of commonality with the Empire in 303. So the Ross gets obviously developed in 303, and ultimately the Mark I and Mark II get brought into service. And it's particularly the Mark II, of which there's 5 stars models patterns. Like you can get a Mark II 5-star. That there was enough little incremental changes they made, and each one of those is a star. Yeah, but the rifle in general remains the same. So they changed they put a charger bridge on it ultimately, but it doesn't start that way. The sights get changed. The bayonet lug gets added. Like all these things, it's just a litany of, dare I say, typically Canadian. There's nothing straightforward about it. But that's what the militia are armed with, is this essentially at the eve of the Great War, the militia are armed with Mark II Rosses, which is a 5-round non-charger loading, except for specific circumstances, rifle. It's very close to the length of the old Lee Enfield. I'm the exact measurements I can't bring to mind right now, but I think it's just slightly shorter. It's certainly longer than the SMLE, which is what the British regular army is then equipped with. And in true Canadian fashion, when the Great War happens, everybody coalesces, or the call for volunteers comes out, and everyone gets sent to Valcartier. And what happens at Valcartier? They issue the next Mark of Ross. So literally marching to war, they're going to get on troop ships very soon. They're all issued with a rifle that no one's ever seen before.
Nice.
And the Mark III, which I don't even know that, like, is Mark III the right designation to put to that rifle? Because when you compare the 1 and the 2, there are definite similarities in terms of the way the bolt head is made, and the not geometry necessarily, but the mechanics of it and the way it looks. They're very similar. But when you go to the Mark III, it's a completely different rifle. And the only similarities between the Mark II and the Mark III are the fact that it is a straight pull rifle. But, the bolt head is completely different. It's angle. It works at 90-degree difference in angle. It's got the multi-lugs on it instead of the two big chunky ones that the Mark II had. It's got a 5-round external magazine, not the non-charger loading 5-round internal magazine. There's all these differences. The stock is of a different profile. So yes, it is a Mark III Ross. It's almost a different rifle. But what they find very soon on, when they're in Valcartier ramping up to be sent overseas, is that they start seeing there's problems with the rifle. And that's generally pertaining to quality. Some of the metallurgy is not perfect, or not even close to perfect. And that is driving some issues with parts that are not functioning or breaking and or deforming, which then are causing further problems, and it compounds. One of the stories is that the bolt stop, which prevents the bolt from actually being withdrawn all the way out of the rifle in the case of cleaning it, is the cross section of the bolt stop is very small, and it's just at one corner of the bolt head that actually hits it to stop the bolt from being withdrawn. And the bolt head's not tempered correctly, for lack of a better term. So as you're firing this thing and you work the bolt like a soldier in a soldierly manner, it's not some sort of quiet, one finger pull it back and the cartridge or the case comes out. It's like you grab it and you work the bolt.
Yeah,
and so you do that, slamming it into the bolt stop as it stops, and then driving it forward, and it's deforming the bolt head. Well, then you jam it into the chamber, into the breech, and that deformed piece of metal is now creating friction. And so when you go to open it, and it's obviously doesn't happen in immediately sequential, it's a buildup of this problem as one of the problems with the Ross. But then now you need more force. And the more force you put on the bolt, the harder it slams back into the bolt stop, and the more deformed it gets. And then you push it in. Like, you can see where this is going. And then, so they do they try to fix that problem starting in Valcartier. But then they're off you go. You need to be on the front. We need to get you overseas. And things are being built from nothing. The army is being built from nothing at the time, right? In terms of its capabilities, which later would be, world class. But in 1914, it definitely is not. So you get overseas, and now you introduce ammunition made by the British. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that ammunition, but in terms of their production capacity and the numbers of facilities that make their ammunition, the tolerances are a lot wider, a lot greater. So instead in Canada, the ammunition is made under a very, close scrutiny and very controlled environment. So let's just call it plus or minus, 2,000s, for lack of a, just pick something, 2,000s.
Yeah.
Well, ammunition in Britain is plus or minus 5,000s. And again, I'm just pulling a number out of the air. Now you put British ammunition, which technically fits in it, into the Ross Mark III, which has a very tight chamber and can't accommodate that differentiation. I mean, that batch of British ammunition might be just fine in it, but this batch, not so much.
Yeah, next batch.
Now you get this problem that's compounded with the metallurgy and the quality control. Now you've got issues with jamming of cartridges in the chamber, or not feeding properly, or sticking, and now you're a real problem. And after the very first major battle the Canadians fight in the Great War, almost immediately after, people are looking around saying, you know what, I might just lose this in the mud, or somewhere.
Yeah.
The shell goes off and I might be able to pick up from a wounded British soldier, because at the time, especially in that early battle, which is the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915 in April, there's British and Canadian soldiers sort of mixing in varying parts of the front, because it's such a desperate battle to try and stop the Germans. Well, they immediately start collecting, both at an unofficial, but also very early on an official capacity. Yes, pick up. And Sir John, Sir John French ultimately orders the First Division in 1915 to re-equip, of which that's the army in the field at that point. The other subsequent divisions, all the way up to and including the Fourth Division, are finally arriving in 1916 in time for the latter part of the Battle of the Somme. The 2nd and 3rd Division have actions, before that. But on the eve of the Battle of the Somme, which is a famous or infamous British battle in July 1916, Haig, who's now the commander of the BEF, issues a directive to say all Canadian divisions will be re-equipped. Obviously, that doesn't happen immediately, and that happens in June, I believe. The battle starts in the beginning of July. So eventually that happens. And so the service life of the Ross actually in theater lasts from, they land in France in February 1915, and it's essentially taken out of service by summer of 1916. So what's that, like 17 months?
Yeah, that's
that's
not long.
And they're used against in training or back at home and that kind of thing, but they're not used by the Canadian Corps after that. And then we adopt the SMLE. Had we been able to right off the bat, the story would have been different. We would have been armed with the same rifle as the rest of most of the empire anyway. And those issues perhaps wouldn't have manifested themselves with the ammunition and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very Canadian chapter in military history. And I mean, I enjoy shooting the Ross. It's a good rifle to shoot. Some of the tropes that you hear about it, obviously the quality issues, the issues with the Ross got rectified.
Yeah.
Right? They were withdrawn. The chambers were reamed, and in the Ross rifle story, it actually has the dimensions they were reamed to in it, which is a really weird book. It's like written by 3 different people and not edited properly together, and it's very disjointed to read it. But that's all we have as far as a reference to it. But it has the dimensions that it was to begin with and what it got reamed to. So then it relaxed the dimensions a little bit and allowed for higher or lower tolerance ammunition to be used. But by that point, it was like everyone's fed up with this. Like there's zero trust in this rifle. And also we want to be common with the rest of the troops on the Western Front in particular, right? So that's the British, Australian, New Zealand, South African troops. They all have the SMLE by this point. So, it's something that should have happened earlier. And whatever fixes that got done to it got done, but it was just too late, too little, too late almost.
Yeah.
But I enjoy shooting the Ross. And they were pinned so that you can't take the bolt apart and put it back together wrong. Right. So all these issues that are famous in their infamy, if that's the way to describe that.
Yeah,
they do get fixed. They do get fixed. They even come up with a short version of the Ross. Again, just no appetite. Move on. Too late. Too bad.
Yeah.
So I found it to be very accurate. The sights are no more complicated. Some people talk about sights as being really not good or something. They're a very good set of sights, and they're no different to a number 4 set, like a number 1 sight on a number 4, the ladder with the micrometer adjustment to it, or even the later Mark 3 and 4 with the slider on it. It's still incremented by, you can find those markings on a Ross sight. So, I don't understand people's the trope that you hear about as they're, the sights are overly complicated and whatnot. Well, they're not really. Yes, they have a vernier scale on them, but don't use that. Use the yard scale, which is around the corner on it, right? Like those are the kind of answers to that.
Yeah.
And I found them to be very with the fully hooded front sight, fits perfectly in that aperture, and it just makes for a very natural sight picture, in my estimation anyway. So yeah, I enjoy shooting the Ross, and just a real, in terms of Canadian military history, just an absolute real touchstone. That was a long explanation.
That's okay.
It's an excellent explanation. I enjoy the Ross story thoroughly. And anytime I get more information, I love it. Weren't they fairly popular with target shooting though at the time?
Right. Well, they certainly I believe they were used in Britain, like at Bisley at the big imperial meetings and stuff, and I think they were used in 280 as well, and they cleaned up there to the point where it was like, you're not allowed to shoot those. And they came up with, and that's where some of the stars come into play as well, because some of them didn't have bayonet lugs on them, right? They're like kind of blurring that. It's supposed to be a military competition, and you don't have a bayonet lead on your rifle. So
Yeah. Also,
there's
it's
no rifle in the
more and
world
more
that
like a
doesn't have a-
target gun. Yeah.
right. So there's it's interesting where some of these things have come from. But yes, I would say that in the target shooting, there you kept, snipers use them. There's pictures out there of snipers on the Western Front with a telescopic prismatic. I can't remember the name of it. It's quite well known as being relatively poor set of optic on it. I just can't remember the name of it. Sorry. But the accuracy of the Ross is something. It's got a huge sight radius, right? It's just massive when you compare it to the SMLE. And so that's a benefit for an iron sight shooter. Yeah, I really enjoy it.
And with closely matched ammo to a refined chamber, your accuracies is going to be better as well. So
Sure.
a marksman sniper position could definitely get better precision out of that rifle in that regard.
And would you
grunt on the front line?
Right, sure. And you would also have the capability based on what you're doing to, husband supplies of ammunition, because you're not plowing through stuff. If I've got 300 rounds of good Canadian stuff, I'm going to keep that. I'm not going to burn through 300 rounds over the next year or whatever because of the nature of the work that I do. Or maybe you would, but you know what I mean, though, is that you're not somebody that's just going to receive what they get given and put it in the pouch and ultimately put it in the rifle and go into action. Right. So, yeah, I did, when I did the first Ross video on the channel, one of the things about it being long and it's a target rifle, all that kind of stuff. Well, I laid them down with an SMLE right beside it and put the bayonets on both of them, and they're the same length. And to think about anytime you would be doing anything in relation to fighting, whether it's on the defensive or the offensive, your bayonet's going to be fixed, right? So they're going to be the same degree of awkwardness as an SMLE, the Ross I'm speaking of. Yeah. So if you put it in that context of the fact that it's too long, it's too unwieldy, well, actually, in terms of its length, just its length, it's the same length.
Yeah.
From butt to the tip of the bayonet. And that's what you're going to have to maneuver down the trench with. So where does that argument come from? Is it ever on routine things where you just got it slung over your shoulder? Sure. But in terms of actual use in the context of, say, the Western Front or something, is it really that much different in terms of its handiness or anything like that? I would argue that it's nowhere near as much as the trope would lead you to believe.
Yeah, that might be one of those things where it's just kind of a rumor that's been passed down through the generations that sometimes doesn't get quite questioned as thoroughly as it should.
Right.
So
there's a lot of that in the world of where I deal with a lot of tropes. The Mad Minute's another one of my favorites. Lots of stuff that I've been able to actually, because of the nature of the channel, just look at and approach from as logical a place as I can, based on the documentation, based on the manuals, based on all that kind of stuff, and come up with an argument. Usually it's against the trope, the common conception, is to say that's wrong. And it's actually, this is the way it is. And it's wrong for these reasons. Right? And this is the reality, is also the other piece is like, if it's wrong, then what's right? And
exactly.
Explore that as well, right?
It's different when you have lore, but when you have the receipts to back it up, it kind of puts it into some of those arguments.
That's a good way to put it, right? There's something that you can point to, right?
Well, that's not what they did. Well, this sheet from that time period said that's exactly what they did, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
Let's spin up a little different question here. Your favorite metallic cartridge versus your favorite paper cartridge?
Oh, it's got to be the 45 caliber Martini round. Yeah, and it's a good thumper. It knows you're shooting it. It's relatively accurate as far as the genre. It's not as, the Martini is not as accurate as, say, like a Sharps or a rolling block, just by nature of the way the chamber, and especially the way the ammunition fits in the chamber, is totally different from something more contemporary to us now, which is like the Sharps, like the way the lead into the chamber and the lead into the rifling is much more conventional. But the Martini was made with different things in mind, so it inherently isn't, the barrel's tapered, for example. right? Up into the first 10 inches. It's wider at the throat and then it eventually gets to 4 or 5.
Yeah.
So, that's got some things that interesting aspects that come into play in terms of accuracy. But in terms of just the history behind it, and shooting martinis is fun. Like it's, it's
they look great too.
Sure. And the
Very
look of them is good. And the great big huge.
Yes.
Like it knows. And when you put those in your hand, and it's funny, whenever I've pick up a 303 round after that, you're like, whoa, it feels like a 22.
Yeah.
When you compare it to that.
Is this 5.56 I'm shooting now?
And then paper cartridge is the Enfield paper cartridge. I mean, it's really the only one that's out there.
Yeah.
And as my friend at papercartridges.com, Brett, would attest to as well, it is perhaps the the pinnacle, but the acme of paper cartridge development in a military arm anyway. It took a long time to perfect. It didn't arrive unseen in exactly the way it needed to be, but over a fairly short period of time, I mean, it was years, they modified it and brought it to a point where they were most happy with it. And what you need out of a military cartridge in that era, you get out of that. I don't know if do either of you shoot black powder or like anything old like that? Because Brett Gibbons is his name, and he's written a series of books on the subject of the rifle musket and its sort of impact on warfare, called The Destroying Angel. And then he written another one called The English Cartridge, which was the American way they referred to British service cartridges. Millions were imported during the American Civil War. And actually, the British style of cartridge was officially adopted by the Confederacy, though they were unable to really match the quality and of paper and bullet that the British were, because it was the Confederacy at war with an economy that was being, strangled by the North. So there were some issues at play there, but it was officially adopted anyway. And yeah, definitely those two, because before the Enfield cartridge, it's just literally a paper cartridge as far as the mainstream service round goes, a ball and a paper wrapper and some powder. And the Snyder's interesting. It's certainly easier to load the Snyder. You can do it by hand. You don't have to do once you fire form the casings in the modern context. Fire form your casings. You use a bigger bullet than it was historically used, bigger in the terms of diameter. Then you can just use your thumb and push it in, and it'll still shoot 6-inch groups at 100 yards. So that's I've come to know what I should expect in these various arms as we go through history, based on what I've been able to achieve. And so I know that if I was, when I see a given group, I can compare it to what I know to be sort of best practice, and do I need to modify that or not? And also my expectation, sort of what I know to be good and what I know to be bad. And there's some historical figures to back that up. And
let's go into that. We actually had that on the list. What is the precision? Like, was there during the manufacturing of these rifles and testing, was there a precision standard they were held to, like during military trials?
So you're talking about the parts, like the pieces themselves, or are you talking about the ability to shoot?
A grouping
terminal
of
performance.
Yeah, terminal. Terminal performance is a little bit different.
Ballistic performance.
Grouping on paper.
Yeah. Right.
Precision.
So, you'd be surprised at how generous the standard it was, and the standard that was typically achieved. So in the Victorian era, there was a term called figure of merit, which is essentially, I can't remember the exact, is it standard? No, mean radial deviation. It's basically a figure that's arrived at through an average of how far away. First of all, you calculate where the center of the group is by averaging all the rounds on the target in terms of their relationship on that target, and you come up with, this is mathematically the center of the group.
Yeah.
And then from that point, you plot the distance to every round from that imaginary point. And then that distance, so let's say you fire 20 rounds, you've got 20 distances, and some of them are right next to that point, and some of them are like way over here somewhere. But you measure all of them and then average all those numbers, and that's the figure of merit.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that does is actually a much more powerful way to gauge if we can make the differentiation, and people get upset about this from time to time, about accuracy and precision.
Yes. Yeah.
But just simply as a way to illustrate what I'm talking about. If accuracy is your ability to actually hit the target, and the precision is basically the size of the group.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So the way to measure that precision is actually, it's a much more effective tool, but you have to understand where, like, what that number refers to and what is good and what is bad. So when I say, man, I shot a 1-inch group with this rifle, generally people will be like, wow, that's pretty good shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But if I were to say, geez, with my Enfield, I can just about get to 2-inch figure of merit. Like, first of all, if you think it's a group size, you're like, yeah, that's not so bad for a 200 or 150-year-old rifle. But then you realize, oh no, it's not the group size. That's actually an average of all those rounds in relation to the center of the group.
Yes.
But that'll generally tell you that how big it is. So if you have a figure of merit of 10, well, that's just the average. So the group is going to be, like almost 3 times that size.
Yeah, you got some at 5, you got some at 15.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what figure of merit does is the example given, if you fire, say 4 rounds, and they all end up at the corners of a 6-inch square. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, whatever the diagonal of a 6-inch square is, I guess, right? But it's call it 8 inches across. Right?
Yeah.
So your group size is 8 inches, right? Because those rounds that's the farthest away that round is, right? So you get, and they're spaced out evenly around that. So that's an 8-inch group. Everyone would say that is an 8-inch group. But now, what if you shot that same group? Sorry, not the same group. But you shot the same 4 rounds, but 3 of them were like almost touching, but 1 was still at that far corner.
Yeah.
That's still an 8-inch group. But which one mathematically is more precise?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the modern term is mean radius, I think, is
right.
What the modern term is for that.
Right. So that's the way accuracy is measured or precision, or whatever you would call it, in the Victorian era. And it's in the military PAMs of how to do it. If you're doing any testing, like, I think this rifle might be shot out or something. Well, let's set up at 500 yards and shoot 20 rounds, and we'll see what we get. And if it's below a certain number, you're going to ask me for numbers now, aren't you?
You don't have to have that number, but just some ballpark numbers is fine.
I'll tell you what I can shoot based on my rifles and my loading. So the Enfield, like a P53, I can get to shoot just approaching 2-inch figure of merit. Yeah. The Snyder, I can get about 1.5 inches. Yeah. And the Martini, I think I've been able to get to just over 1. Which is exceptional. Usually it's around.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah,
it's around, and that's a 1-inch figure of merit, mind you.
Yes.
And that's at 100 yards. With the 303, I've got them sub-inch, like 0.93. And these are all 10-round groups, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't shoot anything less than 10 rounds to do testing.
Yeah, good statistical significance. Well, once you hit that 10, 20 is a little bit closer to ideal, but 10 is
for sure. And when I was working up my P53, when I got the bullet mold made, and I was really trying to figure this thing out, I was shooting 20-round groups, and that's a lot of lead and a lot of powder. And it was like 1,200 rounds I took with different bullets and different lengths of bullets and different cavities and different powder charges, like 3 variables easy. So that's why I took so much. But in retrospect, it was probably too much. And now I sort of settle on 10 rounds, and that gives me generally the idea that I'm looking for.
Yeah.
But with 303, as I mentioned that, and then I haven't really done with my 303 hand loads, like cast loads, which is what I typically shoot out of the SMLE. It's something similar to like my Lee Metford and my magazine Lee Enfield. They're about the same. They're a little bit slower coming out of the SMLE because of the shorter barrel, but generally the same sort of accuracy. And things like the Ross and the number 4, I haven't really done much figure of meriting. Those would be 5-round groups of anywhere from 2 to 4 inches. So it's pretty comparable for a military rifle of anywhere, even today, is what you'd be looking at. So that's in terms of, and when we get into the older smoothbore stuff, it's really difficult to put some sort of number to, because they're so random, especially when you get out to 100. They're
Oh
big.
yeah,
It's a big
shotgun dispersion.
Yeah. And I shoot all my smoothbores with military style ammunition, so there's no patches, there's no wads. The Brown Bess is a like 76 caliber bore, and I shoot a 69 ball out of it, and that was the service round.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of windage in there, and as a result, as it was back then, although there's all kinds of people that can either claim and or demonstrate. There are some, hitting targets at 200 yards away and this kind of thing. It's like, yeah, but invariably they don't shoot cartridges. I shouldn't say invariably, but most often they don't. They're trying to use like a technique that it gets the very best out of a smoothbore. And especially like in a military arm, like an India pattern musket, thing's clunky as hell. The lock is huge. The amount of metal moving when you squeeze the trigger is like unbelievable. And it not only is it a lot of mass moving, but it's slow. So it's chunk, and everything's just really chunky. Whereas you compare that to a smoothbore, like 50 caliber, hunting rifle with like a finely tuned lock that's almost as fast as a percussion lock. Yeah, your performance is going to be way better. Right. So again, it's that the military paradigm of the arm that I'm talking about, so that's what I shoot out of all my smoothbores, and resultingly, they don't necessarily perform like an Enfield or like something later, for sure. So I guess that's the best way to describe it. You ask about numbers and accuracy. Like I can tell you what I get, and I'd have to dig and get all my figures out for figures of merit for like the Martini and the Snyder and the Enfield. I think off the top of my head, at 500 yards, the Enfield was considered shot out or not performing correctly with a figure of merit of 14 or 15 inches. That's at 500 yards.
Yeah.
So just, is that 3 inches at 100? If you want to just draw the triangle back.
Yeah.
So I'm shooting almost 2. So I'm probably doing a little bit better than the bare minimum that would have been required in the era. So again, I'm happy with that. And, I have plates, pie plate size steel plates or whatever. You can knock those down at 100 yards all day long with 353 in my Enfield and my powder charge, which I've worked out to be the best performing in my rifle. Because much like other aspects of shooting, especially when it comes to black powder, you have the same rifle as I do, but you use my ammunition, it'll shoot differently. And then add the muzzle loading gods on top of that, and you're another set of variables that you can't control, and you'll never get the answer you're looking for. So I've developed loads and tuned them to the best performance while still maintaining the historical kind of bent. Yeah. So
for sure.
I don't use smokeless other than in where it's demanded, like in 303. And I, substitutes, black powder substitutes, I don't use. I use real black powder, et cetera, et cetera. That's just my preference. Some people physically can't get their hands on it, so they can't. And I wouldn't begrudge them not to use it. So,
yeah.
But as far as the 10-round groups, I think nine hole reviews of cartridges would probably be sufficient. That was a segue. It was like, what you've worked with some content creators in the States. What's that experience been like?
It hasn't been, I haven't done it a lot. I worked with, you mentioned 9-hole. That was a good segue because I did do a Martini video with Henry, which was, it would have been wonderful if we could have been together and done it. But as it was all remote. And, but I found that to be just a really fun project. And to see the way he worked his martini through to a degree where he could shoot their course of fire, and to see the success on the very last round and the look on his face, it warmed my heart.
Yes.
And perhaps he was coming from an unfamiliar state with the martini, and to bring it to a point where he achieved the aim, to me anyway, I was really excited. So when I saw, he sent me the raw footage for me to then, react to when I did my part of the video. But he's like, yeah, and super excited that they got there literally on the last round. And, but then it was also really demonstrative of the capabilities of it and what would have been expected, because they're shooting at those little 3/4 size targets, or even if they're full size, they're still like torso only. Yeah. And to be able to hit something like that at 500 yards with a rifle like that is still something to say.
Oh yeah.
So that was a really fun project. I've done a project with, I mentioned Rich before. I visited him in the UK, and we shot the Bren and the Vickers and hung out, which was a really fun experience. I'm going to hopefully do something again with him in the near future, just remotely talking about stuff. And I would say the marquee, in terms of my dealing with other creators and other channels, was Thias and May and company, because at CN Arsenal. And I just have, I could spend another hour just going on about the kind of people they are, what they were able to bring to bear on my behalf, the generosity. I literally could talk for an hour about it. That's how meaningful it was and how kind of good people they are. They're just fantastic. So that was an incredible experience, being obviously where we are. Those kinds of opportunities don't come by except in very specific circumstances, of which, 99.99999% of us will never get a chance to experience. This was something that was, logistically, it was difficult, especially for them, like finding the contacts and collecting them and bringing everything together. David, through his company, was able to bring some of the Sten guns, who's an associate of CN Arsenal and owns the range we shot at. So just fantastic. And I if I could thank them more, I could, but I just, I know I kind of lost for words, because especially when you get to these moments, you start thinking back to what that experience was like. You just get kind of glossy eyed and just, look off into the distance and take deep breaths and sigh, because it was just so fantastic. And the result of that, which only a fifth or a sixth of that has been presented on the channel to date, because of other aspects which are typically Canadian in scope, in the sense I can't, have access to these things necessarily in the way I want to at home. So some of the preamble to the shooting piece, because with those, when I was in South Carolina, we shot the Bren, the Lewis, the Sten, the Enfield revolver, the 38, and the Webley 4.55, and the FN in the guise of a Canadian FNC1. It was a Canadianized version. So there were 6 that I shot, and I wanted to treat each of those the same way as you may or may not have seen the Bren series, which is an introduction. An introduction, which is, well, just as it says, talk about the paradigm, how it was used, the targetry, all that kind of stuff, and then a training video about how they were trained on it, whatever that weapon may be. And I did the same approach with the Martini as well, in terms of the drills they got taught and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, in the logical progression, to do the range work. But as it stands, all the range work's done, but all the preamble, and I was able to do the Bren gun series through I think I've used a total of 4 or 5 Brens in that series, only 2 of which were live. The one I shot in South Carolina, and one at home here, lent in a museum facility. So I was able to use that with dummy rounds. So it's a fully functioning Bren, but done obviously in controlled environment and on the premises and that kind of stuff. So but the other ones were all deactivated, which just really rubs me the wrong way to have to deal with. But such is our country in terms of the use of those. And so there's only certain things that I can demonstrate, but I still want to, because there are some things that you can demonstrate without firing.
Mm.
And also some of the talky bits, the preambles and the, if it makes a big difference being able to stand and talk about something, holding it in your hand,
Yeah.
just for presentation purposes, in my mind anyway, than
Oh,
it
for
is
sure.
if I just stood there and talked about it. And
Mm.
so I've made that deal with the devil, as it were, and I'm accepting of the reality. So I'm in the process of the Lewis is proving to be exceptionally difficult. Because
Is that
it's
because
even
it's so
less common than a
old,
brand.
or yeah, I can't see them being super popular.
Yeah, I mean the Lewis, that experience was utterly like eye-opening, and like it was the easiest shooting machine gun, even compared to the Bren. It just chugged along, and I just put myself in the headspace of the Great War
Hmm.
and about what it brought to the infantry of the Great War. And apart from the mechanics of it, which are really steampunky and clunky, and it's very complicated and very early generationally, but it just laid there and it would pound the rounds out just incredibly smoothly and accurate. The one we had it actually broke a firing pin, but other than that, functioned just fine. But it was surprising how smooth, how the recoil was easy. It was there, but it was easy. The gun's fairly heavy to begin with, so it absorbs that piece.
Yeah.
But it was probably the most surprising result. And I obviously gone and fired the Bren before, so I knew sort of generally what to expect. When I fired the Lewis for the first time, I was like, "Wow, that was incredible."
That was good.
and it was accurate. It was just a really incredible experience. So again, another long-winded answer to my experiences down south, and in this case across the Atlantic. But just I haven't had a bad experience in that relationship with other channels to date yet. I'm very fortunate enough to have been able to experience some of this stuff at the behest of some of these other people, which have been very generous.
I've thoroughly enjoyed the Bren series. I was extremely excited when you released the first video, and then I'm like, I gotta wait another month for the second one.
Well, see, the first one was obviously any Bren that's in the first one, other than the actual firing bits, which I think I included, but those were shot in South Carolina. Like the atmospheric shooting, there's only like a little blur, a little like a magazine's worth kind of thing.
Mm.
But then when it came to do the training piece, is how to get that organized, and I actually had to construct a set in a room.
I saw that platform looking thing.
And I made that platform and covered it in Hessian as a way to sort of just make the camera angle a little bit better, because I didn't want to just set the camera up and like shoot on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted it to be raised a bit so you see it from a bit of a different, a more appealing angle. But then the backdrop was all constructed in the corner of a room, and it was a little bit of logistically, it was a bit tough to get the way forward figured out. Like, where am I going to do this? How am I going to make this come to play? And then the materials, how am I going to make the set? And I didn't want to just hang some like a curtain across the back and make it look Bush League. So I was going for like a hut, the inside of a hut. I was, some sort, and anyway, it turned out to be just like 1/4 inch or 3/16 plywood with some 1x4 like battens, and just screwed it together and then propped it up, and then had a couple of stays off camera to hold the whole thing up. But it was all flimsy. But as long as I wasn't banging it, it sort of just
yeah. You're not playing basketball with that wall there anytime
Definitely
soon.
not. Definitely not. You know, I mean, I think there was times that when I had my buddy helping me out, and in one of the cases, one of us kicked it. The picture's rattling, and the whole thing looked like it was going to fall over. I'm like, no. So in the movie magic piece, you just don't touch it. It looks just fine. So anyway, hopefully I'll be able to do the same with the Lewis. I have access to one, but it's in a very controlled environment. And so it's going to be something like the Bren to demonstrate the drills and that kind of thing. I'll be able to do that. But that's the second of 3 videos. I need to find something I can take out into the bush and I'd like to be able to film, things comparable and show the way that being in a natural environment is, to me, much more interesting than being in a classroomy kind of,
Oh yeah, especially the environments that you
Have
are
access
able to
to.
shoot in.
Right.
A little bit jealous coming from a couple Alberta boys here. So
Well, again, very, very fortunate. Very
yes.
fortunate. I consider myself. So,
Mhm.
you just be always mindful, of course, of making sure it's left in the way you find it and husband it, as it
Mhm.
were. And so I have a few areas that I go, and they're all over. They're Alberta
Mhm.
and in BC. Of course, both provinces are pretty big, so I have a few go-to spots,
Yeah.
and some of which are a long way away. But that's the way. That's what it takes.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I like camping too. I like outdoor stuff. So if I can mount a little mini expedition somewhere and hang out for a couple of days and get some channel work done as well, and then have a nice campfire after, then that's about
Yeah.
a perfect getaway for me.
I've done the exact same thing too. It's like we're going camping and I'm working on these videos
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. The nature calls.
Yes.
Has anyone bumped into you while you're filming and they just kind of think, I've seen a ghost just standing in a full red uniform in the middle
Yeah.
of nowhere?
Yes, I have. And the reactions have been nothing like aggressive.
Mm,
Like there's never
good.
any like
Good.
or
Yeah.
like a real like dickhead.
Mhm.
But there's been like complete flabbergast, kind of like what?
Jaw drop.
Yeah. And there's been people that have just sort of come up and walked up and said, and I always greet people, of course, and
Yep.
how are you doing today or whatever. They're pretty good. And then they ask, what are you up to? Or what are you doing? And I tell them, like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then, would you like to see this P-53? And they're like, no, I've never seen something like that before. Well, here it is. And sometimes it goes that way. And one in particular, he was on a quad, and I was in the middle of something costumey, and I hear it coming. I'm like, oh yeah. And of course, I had been just set up for a shot, so I'm halfway through the shot, and I can hear the quad. I'm like,
Yeah,
oh,
of course. Yep.
here we go. And so I stopped and turned the camera off, just so I wasn't wasting, chip space.
Yep.
And then turned to sort of meet him. And he came around the corner. It was about 50 yards away, idling, and he stopped the quad. Like, oh, I see somebody's down there. And I'm standing there in all this get up. And usually there's some sort of like wave. And I waved at him, nothing. And he was in full like hunting cam with a helmet and, like a rifle case across the handlebars or somewhere on the side or something.
Yeah.
And he just literally stood there. He was standing up on his quad, just it was idling. And I'm like, hello, trying to get some sort of reaction. And he literally stood there for about 45 seconds, just watching and looking, not moving a muscle. And then I'm like, okay, what's
No reaction.
Usually someone's going to come up and say something to you, like, hello.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what are you doing?
A nod or something
Just
at least.
Deadpan, visor down, full face, and just and then sat down, put it in reverse, and drove away. Anyway, it made me laugh because it was a kind of an atypical reaction. But yes, that's it happens from time to time, but not all the time. I usually try and pick places that are out of the way for a number of reasons, but being that way, typically there's not that many people that come by.
It just shows the quality of your character, because I would be messing with people the second they came up on me.
We got.
I react the same way that I would react if I saw something that was kind of weird and interesting. Is like literally like say hello.
Yeah.
But starts there, like, hey, how's it going? What are you up to? Like, what's going on? Like, this looks pretty interesting. Well, what is this? Whatever it may be. And I've come across guys who are hunting or whatever, but just engage, have a bit of a chat.
Yeah.
And you're doing your thing, I'm doing my thing, and that's all cool. And I'm going that way, and you're going this way. Well, okay, have a great day. Best of luck to you. And that's the way it sort of comes out. So
we had Yukikazi chime in. I have a friend who is a semi-pro ghost hunter. I don't know. I didn't know there was such thing as a professional ghost hunter. I've been to places like Fort Mifflin, Gettysburg, etc., and I've definitely ran into ghosts as well. So there is a possibility out there. So,
well, maybe if it's like some sort of dusk sequence or something, and there's
Mhm.
mist or something, and come around the corner, and then I can just charge off into the bush and then leave them thinking.
Yes,
But,
that would
but
definitely be
typically, a
very
red coat and
ghost-like.
white belts and stuff doesn't lend yourself to hiding very well.
No,
No.
no, that's it. That's the unfortunate part. The appearing part is very easy. The
Yeah.
disappearing part, a little bit more difficult.
Lieutenant, have you seen my platoon? And just walk away.
Well, we're over the 2 hour mark here. So, Mike, is there any questions you wanted to field to Rob before we wrap this up?
I think we've covered a good chunk of what we needed to
Yeah.
cover.
No, I think it was definitely a very good conversation. I'll leave it to you, Rob. A few things to get you to finish up on. What is the latest historical event or rifle that's kind of a top of mind for you? And name some things you're thankful for.
So, in terms of what was the first one? In terms of the latest.
What's the most recent historical event or rifle that's kind of top of mind for you? Like, what's tickling your fancy as of current?
Well, so dealing with the FN, right, with something that I mean, I've shot. I in South Carolina, I shot the range course was actually a Canadian one from the 1970s that I used because I couldn't find one that was late 50s. I had a 50s one, but that's the Lee Enfield version. Anyway, so I shot that, and so the series, I want to develop that as best I can, but it would be really cool to be able to bring that series further and deal with, say, something like the Falklands. With different kit, admittedly a slightly different rifle in its furniture. Like, it'd have to be one that looked British with black plastic furniture and that kind of stuff. But there'd be a lot of ways that I could incorporate, what I do in terms of like the battle series. I could talk about something because you can add color to a historical discussion about a battle with, being a single person lying on the ground doing some shooting and running around, as I've done in the past. So I think that's probably, if I was on a wish list, that would be really, but then I'd also need the right kind of ground.
Yeah.
And I've actually been to the Falklands, and
interesting.
It's pretty special. And special in a number of ways, one of which is that there are no trees, or the only ones that are there are the ones that are planted. But, the ground is very, very particular in terms of that. But, I can get around that. But dealing with that would be something I'd be really interested in doing, which is the sort of the historical application of an arm, not necessarily from the channel, because I don't own one, because it's Canada and we can't. But that, I'm still buzzing from my Sea and Arsenal experience of being able to sort of check all those things off as far as shooting them properly in a military context, and sorry about that, and being able to just think back and say what, that achieved so much that I thought I would never be able to even come close to. So I guess that's, if you answer that question in terms of the most recent arm, would be that, which is sort of the last lineage before you get into something black and plastic, and in the Canadian and British context, right? Because after that we get into the 5.56. So it's a fantastic rifle to shoot, and there's a lot of history there, and a lot of Canadian and British history in relation to that rifle in particular. And I'm not really interested in sort of personal owning of anything black and plastic anyway. So it's sort of, that's where my interest kind of caps at, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
We really don't need to talk about the L85 anyways.
No, I mean, it would be really interesting. I know Mike from Bloke on the Range, a good friend, is in possession of a semi-automatic one that I know he took to a shooting match not long ago and had a very good experience with it. He had some experience in the university, the training, the officer training corps, in carrying that around. So it's a bit of a touchstone for him personally, I think, as well, coming something out of his past. And, so I appreciate him having one, and going through some motions with it, and that real connection that he has to it, regardless of its reputation. To be able to put one through its paces, I wouldn't say no.
Oh no,
for sure.
The only one I know of in Canada is, I believe, a DWAT that's sitting on one website that's been there for 10 years, I think.
Oh, really?
Yep.
So it's unfortunate that those things can't be brought into more of a useful bearing, especially in the right context.
Yes.
But such as us
being Canadian, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's in terms of being thankful for, boy, I have an understanding. I'm going to get total brownie points for this. I have a very understanding wife. Anyway, but I do. And so I remember early on in the channel, somebody had been holding something, like this. And the comment on the video was, "What? This man's married?" And so it made me chuckle. It actually made her chuckle. And, but this is probably fourth down the list of life priorities for me. And so being able to afford time and get some of this stuff done and pursue my hobby is something that I am. It sounds really cheesy, I know, but I know a lot of people who don't get a quarter of the chance to do the stuff they want to do because of other people, whether that's a wife or if it's other family commitments or something like that. And I'm just in a position where I can, and I'm very, very thankful for that. And I'm also thankful for the community that's come up around the channel, that the opportunities that it's opened for me in particular, both in travel, in visiting, in contacts, in learning, especially, but also in being able to, like we talked about at the very beginning, is fill that collection out. Is a lot of my stuff has come from people I know or people that know them. So, I don't have this, but he does. Talk to him, and then I do, and it's like, yes, I'll take that.
Yep.
If you're offering it up, I've had many good friends offer me things that are surplus to their needs. Henry, another friend of the channel, who offered me my Boer Mauser. He had two, one of which had carvings all over it, a real lots of provenance to it. And I'm not a provenance guy. I'm not a markings guy. I don't care, because I want it to shoot. And if it shoots, then I'm okay with that. So he sort of knew that and said, well, I've got two of these things. This one's probably in better condition, but it doesn't have any markings on it. And I kind of like the markings. And he says, before I put it out there, are you interested? And I was like, yes. Especially because of its direct connection for the Boer War. And I've only done one video with it so far, but there might be opportunities to do others and more comparisons or whatnot. And so there's an example. My martini came to me in the same way from a friend who was surplus to their needs. Stuff on the internet, some collector sites I've dabbled in. My Snyder, two of them came from that. One such website. So sometimes you pay a little bit more. Sometimes you take your chances. My P51 came through a contact of a contact, which is when I rank my rifles as being sort of ones that I would never thought of even coming close to owning. I would probably say the P51 mini rifle, which is it's a monster. It's like 702 caliber, and it shoots like a 700 grain bullet. It's crazy. That and my Brunswick, which hasn't really what's the word? Debuted on the channel yet, but it came by me through another friend of the channel, and it's a factory refurbished. Essentially, it's brand new.
Oh wow!
And that's a Brunswick rifle from the 1840s. And so these kinds of opportunities are what I'm talking about when I say that I'm thankful for what the channel has sort of opened up. That it's not a big community around the channel. It's not a big channel, period. But it has opened a lot of really meaningful things to me, both
Mhm.
in people, most importantly, the people that I've met and become friends with, and then the experiences that come out of that, and then also the opportunities in terms of dealing with my hobby and,
Yeah.
and having these things at hand that I can then, have and shoot and enjoy, and
Well, and
hopefully
I think
these things that other people enjoy.
yes, exactly. I was about to say it kind of becomes a full circle moment in that you get to share them with the essentially the world now. So that's a very beautiful thing, and I'd like to thank Rob for coming on, spending the time with us. That's I'm definitely thankful for. So we'll wrap this show up. So a quick, well, hold on a second. I gotta find it in the show notes. Oh, I don't see our knife. Okay. As we all know, working the YouTube grind pays less than a solar farm at a blizzard. If you want to support the channel directly, please head on over to storiedknives.com or cdnprecision.com if you're out east to pick up one of our gardener knives. We think this is one of the best survival type / everyday fixed blade knives available for a very reasonable cost. We're pretty proud of this knife. So please go have a look at a great knife. We'll be confident it'll be on your side for a lifetime. In closing, I'd like to give out to a massive thank you to all of our sponsors. Without you, we wouldn't have a show in the first place. Talking about Shane and Steve with EM Precision Rifles, Miles, Carey, and Cappy with Callsign 66, Duncan and Rob at Bolt Action Coffee, Phil Odell at Odell Engineering, Doug and Niza at March Scopes Canada, Vanya and Carly with Apex Optics, Oscar with Ribstone Gunsmithing, and J.R. Cox with Sterling Arms International. Thank you all an immeasurable amount, and thanks again to Rob.
And thanks to the patrons of British Muzzleloaders for making this all happen.
Yes. Also, yeah, you can shout out your sponsors to those patrons. Definitely do keep it.
Do your shout outs, Rob.
Oh, that was it.
Yeah.
I was just doing saying what I was thankful for. I just, as you're
Yeah.
talking, it was like, oh shoot, I haven't mentioned the patrons, and if it was
Yeah.
out them, it literally would not be happening. So thank you to them.
All right, and we will
And
catch
the
you
cat.
all next week.
Because I have a shotgun and rifle that I use for, and 22 gauge that I use for ptarmigan, moose, and black bear.
You're so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
You're listening to your weekly dose of BS, ballistically speaking.